Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today is part 2 of our updated European Coffee Roaster tier list. And once again, in celebration of hitting the 3,000 subscriber milestone, we are updating our European Coffee Roaster tier list. And if you guys are interested in the criteria for the coffee roasters that did make it onto this list, as well as the tiers themselves, then check out part 1 as all of the information is featured in that video. But we have so much to talk about with so many interesting coffee roasters, so let's jump right back into this list, beginning with the one I probably have the most to say, and the one I've been least looking forward to discussing, which is Manhattan Coffee Roasters, based out of Rotterdam, Netherlands. And of course, I have to heap so much positive praise on them, as they are one of the few coffee roasters that has ever made it into our world-class category, as at one moment, they were probably my favorite coffee roaster in the entire world, as they're the only coffee roaster that's ever had our top coffee of the year. And they had it 3 years running with the Chantuine, a natural processed Ethiopian coffee, the Lady Bermudez, which was the first coffee roaster to release the Lady Bermudez, and then of course the Pepe Hijón Tax-State or wash processed Mejorado, which is probably still my favorite coffee that we've ever reviewed on this channel up to this moment. And outside of that, even some of their standard offerings like the Kianjege, a wash processed Kenyan coffee, is my favorite wash processed Kenyan coffee that we've ever reviewed on this channel as well. Here's where things do get kind of tricky. Recently, they had made a transition from the Probat to a Typhoon, and I feel like that's where they've lost a lot of people, as so many people, including myself, had so many positive things to say about their coffees when they were still roasting on the Probat. That was very much what I was looking for from a coffee roaster, a lighter profile coffee roaster roasting on the Probat, and it showed with how many times we'd reviewed their coffees and how positively we'd spoke about so many of their coffees. Now for me, I don't necessarily think it was as simple as them switching roasting machines where things had changed, given that we did a very special video where we compared the Probat and the Typhoon coffees side by side, and I genuinely had no idea which coffee was which, given that I didn't receive that information until we had actually posted that video itself. And the Probat coffees did win by a slight margin, and I think that was an indication that the profile at that time was pretty similar. But since then, it seems like the profile of the coffees from Manhattan has changed ever so slightly, as they don't feel quite as light as what they once were. And I'm not entirely sure how people perceive Manhattan these days, as the majority of feedback we get isn't necessarily the best. But at the same time, I think that they're probably more popular now than when they were still roasting on the Probat, given that they do seem to release even more coffees and there's even more fanfare around them this time around. So I think that they're doing pretty well for themselves in that regard. As far as it goes for me though, the last couple of coffees we've reviewed from them haven't been anywhere near as good as what we'd once had. It seems like the further away we've gotten from the Probat released coffees, the less I've enjoyed them in general, as right after they had made the transition, I didn't notice that much of a difference. It was prominent enough to the point where I did reach out and ask some people whether or not they had started roasting on the Typhoon. But it was really more recently where I've noticed that I definitely don't enjoy their coffees anywhere near as much as I had in the past. And that's been the sentiment that I've heard from a lot of people as well. Now, Manhattan, the co-owners of Manhattan, are two of the most talented people in the entire coffee world, and they've released some of the most important and influential coffees over the last couple of years, over the last 10 years plus. So I know that the talent's there, I know the ability's there, and I fully believe in them and their ability to get back to that world-class category one day. But truth be told, based off of the experiences that I've had, it just hasn't necessarily been the best. And I don't want to punish them too harshly, given that they've accomplished and achieved so much as of this moment. And I do think that they can get back to that world-class category one day. But for right now, I'm going to put them in the good category, as I do find the majority of their coffees to be about on par with the coffee roasters that we do have in this category. All right. Next up, we have Mock, which is based out of Brussels, Belgium. And they're a coffee roaster that we featured 4 times on this channel. And it is kind of funny, none of the coffees that we've really featured from them have been coffees that I was overly excited about, as the majority of the releases that we've seen available for us to pick up in store haven't necessarily been the most exciting. We have a Brazilian coffee, a Kenyan coffee that did have a tomato note listed on there, and then a Las Lajas coffee. So in theory, they're not necessarily a coffee roaster that I should have enjoyed, and I wouldn't necessarily say that I had the most impressive or amazing experience experiences with them. But what I kept going back to is each one just went above my expectations. So for example, if I expected a coffee to be a B, it would turn out to be a B+. If I expected it to be a C-, it'd turn out to be a C, so on and so forth with every coffee that I've ever tried from them. So as a result, they're better than I would expect, and they've even had one interesting release semi-recently. I think that there was a unique varietal Panamanian coffee that I really wanted, but the shipping costs on it were a little bit more expensive than I was willing to pay for that coffee at that time. I definitely want to try more of their offerings in the future, but for right now, I'll put them in the good category. Again, I feel like they're pretty on par with a number of the other coffee roasters in that category. Right. Next up, we have Nomad, which is based out of Barcelona, Spain, and they're yet another coffee roaster that was featured in our previous European coffee roaster tier list, and I want to say we put them in the good category, and yes, we did. So we've reviewed 9 of their coffees in total up to this moment, with one unofficial review. It was the Red Plum that had been given to us by the co-owner of Manhattan. So that technically didn't count as a review, and we can't put it towards any of our feelings about this coffee roaster. But outside of that, since those reviews and since that placement, I've had much better experiences. I should also put into context that I probably got off to the worst first impression out of any coffee roaster ever with them, given that the Rwandan coffee we reviewed from them was suffering from the potato defect, and it was pretty severe too. And then the washed Ethiopian that we'd reviewed also was one of the most tame coffees that we'd ever reviewed. Outside of that, and since then, we've had a very enjoyable Kenyan coffee. We've also had the Monte Blanco, which I thought was a pretty interesting coffee, but most recently the Acacia Hills Gesha, that Tanzanian Gesha that I very much enjoy from every coffee roaster that I've ever had it from. In addition to that, Nomad is one of the few remaining European-based coffee roasters that do roast in the lighter profile on a drum roaster. They are still roasting on a Probat, so I have to give them props for that, as they're basically now the only flag holder for that. I think the Barn still does, but we don't review Barn coffees anymore. So for that reason, I'm going to bump them up to the great category. I shouldn't say for that reason. It's mostly been because that Kenyan was really good, the Monte Blanco was interesting, and then the Acacia Hills Gesha was also good. So they're definitely capable of producing some very interesting coffees, even if at times they can be slightly inconsistent. All right. Next up, we have People Possession, which is based out of Paris, France. And we reviewed 2 of their coffees, one of which being a Wilton Benitez coffee, and then the other being a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee. So the 2 complete opposite sides of the spectrum when it comes to cleanliness of coffees. And I haven't really enjoyed any Wilton Benitez coffee ever, so it's difficult for me to count that against them. And I won't, but it was that washed Ethiopian coffee that once again I found to be a little bit too tame and lacking any sort of intensity or direction in general. Now, if I understand correctly, and I'm pretty sure of this, I think People Possession and Kawa are technically the same. And a fun little side note on that, People Possession is the only coffee roaster that I could only find just solid black for the little thumbnail that we're including in this video. So that's why I went with one of their coffees, as I do find their designs, their can designs, to be probably the best out of any coffee roaster in the world. The windows design that they have is pretty fun. They've been pretty hilarious in general, and I found this banana one to also be pretty funny. So I love their packaging. Haven't necessarily had the best experiences with their coffees, and the Ethiopia is primarily what I'm basing it off of. Now, they fall into the okay or not my cup range, but given that the majority of their coffees are so heavily processed and intense, then I'm going to put them in this category for right now. We do have one coffee from them that we ordered and we're going to be reviewing in the future, so I definitely feel like they have potential to improve to wherever we put Kawa. I think Kawa is in the good range for us. So I imagine that if we review some more of their coffees that are maybe in line with my own preferences, they're probably right there on par and the same as Kawa in general. But we have to go based off of what we tried from them, and that's why I'm putting them in this category. All right. Next up, we have Rose, which is based out of Zurich, Switzerland, and we've reviewed 3 of their coffees, which was a washed Kenyan coffee that I quite enjoyed, a honey-processed Panamanian Gesha, which I also very much enjoyed, my favorite coffee that I've ever had from them, and then surprisingly my least favorite coffee, an anaerobic wash-processed Finca Soledad coffee, which was a Mejorado. It's the one I probably had the highest expectations for and didn't turn out quite to the level that I was hoping for. And it is worth noting that all of these coffees we reviewed shortly after our first European coffee roaster tier list, so it has been a while since I've tried any of their coffees. And since then, I've heard that they are a little bit more developed than maybe they once were, but that could have changed since then. I honestly don't hear a lot about this coffee roaster, and when I have looked at their website, they do tend to skew in the more experimental, heavier processed offering side of things. So it's been difficult for me to find coffees that I do want to purchase or review from them, and they're not the easiest coffee roaster to obtain either. I think that Kumquat actually carries them somewhat regularly, so I've thought about purchasing some of their coffees, but haven't pulled that trigger. Basically, I'm judging it based off of those 3 coffees, and 2 of those coffees were in the great category. So 2 out of 3, I will put them in the great category. All right. Next up, we have Scenery based out of London, England. And this is another coffee roaster that I have the least amount of familiarity with, as we've reviewed the minimum of their coffees, 2 full bag reviews. One of which was a wash processed Colombian geisha, the El Encanto, and then the other being the wash processed Brazilian coffee. So let me start with this. We are throwing out our El Encanto review, given that that coffee was an anomaly, it was strange, it was weird, and I really don't want to judge them or criticize them for the way that that coffee turned out, because I'm not entirely sure what happened with that coffee, and I heard a lot of feedback that people got some very interesting experiences with that coffee, so we're not going to count that against them. That being said, that means the only other coffee we've reviewed from them is a wash processed Brazilian coffee, and it's going to be very hard to, 1, judge a coffee roaster based off of that, and 2, give them any sort of high praises. It is a wash processed Brazilian coffee, and while I found it to be somewhat interesting, I don't really enjoy Brazilian coffees in general, and this one wasn't necessarily an exception to that. I feel like it falls into the range of, this is okay, it's nothing that's overly special or spectacular, but at the same time, it definitely could have been worse. So for that reason, I'm going to put them in the okay category for right now. Let me say this, when it comes to all of the coffee roasters that are on this list, I feel like they're the ones that have the highest potential to improve from this point going forward, as I've heard a lot of positive things about some of the coffees that they've released over the last couple of years. It's just unfortunate that I didn't get an opportunity to try any of those, and we will be keeping an eye on them, as they do sound like one of the more promising English-based coffee roasters. And as far as English-based coffee roasters go, I feel like their profile is a little closer to what I'm looking for. All right. Next up, we have Sognafjord, which is based out of Sognafjord, I want to say Norway. And they're a coffee roaster. Let me take a look at our notes here. That has been featured primarily in our Cafe Box Advent Calendar series. And yeah, it looks like they just met the threshold, as we've gotten to 4 of their coffees in the Cafe Box Advent Calendar series. Interestingly enough, the one that I highlighted and wanted to point out was a wash processed Chinese coffee, which I think was the first ever wash processed Chinese coffee that we had featured on this channel. Outside of that, the only other experience we have with them is their placement on the Cafe Box Advent Calendar Blind Taste Test series, which usually falls in the middle category. All of their coffees have kind of fallen in that 3-4 range. So for that reason, I feel like that they're okay. And I would definitely like to try something in an isolated setting and see if maybe it's better for me. But based off of those experiences, I'm going to put them right there for right now. All right. Next up, we have Standout Coffee, which is based out of Stockholm, Sweden. And I feel like Standout is pretty popular. They're a very interesting coffee roaster. I have to say that out of all of the coffee roasters we have featured on this list, I'm taking a quick glance at them, they're probably the ones that have the most interesting offerings. I've looked at so many of their coffees and said, that's so interesting. And we've reviewed 3 of their coffees. They have been featured in a couple of our Cafe Box Advent Calendar series as well. And it's pretty safe to say they go in 2 directions that I don't like. And those are the 2 big directions that I don't like. They really love their experimental, out there processed coffees. I mean, they had that infamous, 480-hour Diego Bermudez coffee that we got to try as a sample. And then outside of that, it seems like they just have so many heavily processed coffees, and they usually like to feature some of those in the Cafe Box Advent Calendar. Outside of that, we picked up washed coffees because I wanted to see how their washed coffees would turn out, and I didn't necessarily enjoy them given that the development, once again, isn't in line with my own preferences. They roast a little bit more developed than I would like for a Nordic-based coffee roaster, which is something that we said for Good Life. So for that reason, I mean, those are 2 very big reasons. I personally haven't enjoyed the majority of the coffees I've had from them, and their profiles aren't in line with my own preferences. So I'm going to put them in the not my cup category. I imagine at some point we'll probably revisit them, and I'm really hoping to revisit something from them that is very interesting and in line with my own preferences. Again, if you're ever curious, take a look at their website. They definitely have some interesting coffees from time to time. All right, next up we have Substance Cafe, based out of Paris, France. And they are a newer coffee roaster as far as being featured on this channel goes, as they've been around for a little bit, and they are one of the most discussed kind of cult followed coffee roasters out there, given that their profile is very unique. So they have one of the actually they're the lightest roaster on this entire list, and a lot of people really enjoy that about them. They've inspired so many people as their coffee is just unique in that sense, the lightness specifically. And we've reviewed 4 of their coffees as of this moment, a couple of standard offerings and a couple of higher end offerings. And I definitely had a very strong preference towards their higher end offerings. I feel like that's where they do their best work. And we do have one more review of their coffee coming up here in the near future, as there's another one of their higher end coffees that I am working on. Now, the best coffee I've had from them was the Deborah Terroir, but the coffee that we are going to be releasing from them, I enjoyed even more than the Deborah Terroir, which is a huge credit to them. And I don't know if they're necessarily a decisive coffee or a divisive coffee roaster, as I've heard a lot of people say they're the best in the world, but I've also heard some people say I can't really do a very good job with their coffee. It's kind of tricky. But for me personally, I had really positive experiences with them compared alongside another coffee roaster that we're going to be discussing in this tier list, especially their higher end offerings. For me specifically, I think that they're the best coffee roaster on this tier list. I think that they definitely have world-class potential if they're not already there. And the more I think about it, and the more some other coffee roasters have struggled recently, I would be okay putting them in this world-class category. I think it's hard for me to think of 5 other coffee roasters I like more. But given our slight lack of familiarity with them, I'm going to put them in the amazing category for right now. I do think that they are my favorite coffee roaster on this tier list. All right, let's move on. Next up, we have Supreme Roast Works, which is based out of Oslo, Norway. And they're a very interesting coffee roaster, and I feel like one that's very important for this tier list for a number of reasons. The biggest being that the last time they were featured in our European coffee roaster tier list, they were in the Not My Cup category, and it's because all we had from them was super processed coffees in the Cafe Box Advent calendar. And when we got an opportunity to finally try one of their more standard normal offerings, a wash processed Peruvian coffee, I said, look at that. What I thought all along was true. Their coffees are nice. It's just unfortunate that all we've had an opportunity to try has been their much more heavier and processed out their coffees. So since then, I definitely had a much more improved idea of them, and that goes to show that if we try coffees that are in line with my own preferences from other coffee roasters, like specifically Scenery is the one I'm thinking of, then I do imagine that they'll probably move up to at least this good category. I really appreciated this wash process coffee we had from them, and if we maybe had significantly fewer of those more processed coffees, then yeah, they probably would have gotten here sooner. I like Supreme Roast Works. They're non-heavier offerings. All right, next up we have Swirl, which is based out of Falkenberg, Sweden, and Swirl was featured in one of our Cafe Box Advent Calendar series, and we've done 4 reviews of their coffee since then, including a Las Lajas, which I'm also throwing out because I really didn't enjoy that, nor did I expect to enjoy that Las Lajas coffee whatsoever. Outside of that, the Nicaraguan coffee was fine, but I had some really positive experiences with their Colombian Pink Bourbon and their Ethiopian coffee at times, and it did show the potential that this coffee roaster does have. I feel like they're much more in line with my own preferences. I think that they're roasting on a Gießen. They have the lighter profile, so all of which I'm looking for, especially relative to those other Nordic-based coffee roasters. So Standout, which is more developed than I like, Good Life, which is a little bit more developed than I like, Swirl's offering a intense, cleaner wash number of offerings as well that are on the lighter side of things. So that's much more what I'm looking for a Nordic-based coffee roaster. So for that reason, I'm going to put them in the great category. I think I've had enough positive experiences with their coffees that I can feel comfortable putting them. They're maybe on the slightly lower side of that, but I think that I can justify it based off of some really positive experiences. All right. 2 coffee roasters left. Next up, we have Sweven, which is based out of Bristol, England, and we've reviewed 3 of their coffees. We have a Koji Colombia review from forever ago, and then since then we had a Natural Ethiopia and a Washed Kenyan coffee, which is usually my going to purchase from a coffee roaster safe bet, having to do one non-wash and one washed offering. So that's what happened with Sweven. Same thing with the English profile. It's a little bit more developed than I would necessarily like, but as far as English coffee roasters go, I thought it was fine. They've had some very interesting coffees that I've wanted to purchase from them as well, but we have to go based off of what we've actually tried. Very interesting number of selections. There's somewhere between these two, if I'm being completely honest. And I'm still feeling a little generous, so I'm going to bump them up to the... Actually, I'm going to leave them in the okay category because I'm kind of comparing them alongside... There's somewhere with these coffee roasters. They're either at the very high side of okay or they're at the low side of good. I'm going to put them at the low side of good. I'm going to be generous. All right. And that takes us to our final coffee roaster and the other coffee roaster I was looking least forward to discussing, and that is the Picky Chemist based out of Chouffontaine, Belgium. Okay. If you ask the coffee community, like the true coffee enthusiasts, what they feel about the Picky Chemist, then it is world class. And there are very few coffee roasters that I've heard as much universal praise and acclaim about as the Picky Chemist. And there's so many people that I could probably think of off the top of my head that have said they are not just one of the best coffee roasters in the entire world, but the best coffee roaster in the entire world. And here's where I have to defend myself and plead my case. We have reviewed a lot of the Picky Chemist's coffees. They are probably the coffee roaster outside of Manhattan that we've reviewed the most. We have 12 the Picky Chemist coffee reviews on this channel. And the coffee I liked the most was the Alaska del Sur, which is great because I think a lot of people really like the Alaska del Sur. They were very impressed by it, and I thought it was a very nice coffee. Outside of that, there are a couple of coffees we've had from them that I really didn't enjoy whatsoever. And it is kind of interesting, one of which was an anaerobic honey processed Costa Rican coffee, which I don't think anybody actually liked. I didn't hear any positive feedback on that coffee whatsoever, so I feel like that's fine with me saying I didn't like that coffee. Outside of that, we had the El Placer, which was a coffee I didn't like whatsoever. Again, it had that very hot pot spice peppercorn-like feel, which I thought would be a bit of a sticking point for some people, but I heard some people really loved that El Placer coffee, so I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. So those are two coffees that I would say really didn't like whatsoever. The Horizon Kigoma, the wash process Rwandan coffee, I didn't like either. It felt a little bit too intense. There were some days where I got some very undesirable savory aspects to it and some very overly steeped tea feel at times as well. So didn't necessarily enjoy that coffee. Now, everything else outside of that is somewhere in the middle range. So the washed Ethiopians that we've had, I felt were a little more tame than I would necessarily like. And then the Kenyan coffees that we had also were a little bit more tomato-like than I would necessarily enjoy as well. So those, not necessarily my favorite. And then last, we have the, Gesha Village coffees. And that's what I'd always heard about the Picky Chemist, buy their Gesha Village coffees. That's what's going to really set them apart as being the best coffee roaster in the entire world. And it seems like we got very bad luck with the Gesha Village coffees that we did purchase, because we purchased the honey processed one this past year, which a lot of people said was the most boring of the Gesha Village coffees that the Picky Chemist has ever released. And then the natural that we also picked up from them, which I enjoyed. A lot of people said it was one of the least impressive natural Gesha Village coffees that they'd ever had from the Picky Chemist. So here's where I'm coming from. The coffees that people say are the very best from this coffee roaster, it seems like we've missed out on. And then the coffees that we have tried from them have been coffees that I've heard a lot of people say a lot of the same things about, that they weren't necessarily overly impressive. So if you kind of look through the catalog of what we've reviewed, we have one coffee that I say, okay, this is probably in the amazing to amazing plus category. We've had 3 coffees that were not my cup whatsoever. And then we've had a handful of coffees that fall somewhere in the middle. And that's very hard for me to justify a placement above great. And I know a lot of people won't necessarily like that placement because so many people would say world class without a second doubt, without a second thought whatsoever. But that's my experience. 12 coffees, and I went through each one of them one by one, kind of discussing how we got to that point. And before I finish discussing this coffee roaster, I should say a couple of things. I think that the owner of the Picky Chemist is such an amazing person. They have been nothing but humble and really nice with every single review that we've released. So, and they've been very responsive too. And I've heard nothing but positive things about them as well. So I have massive praise and respect for them as a person. And then the last thing I want to say on this is, maybe this is actually how I feel about this coffee roaster. Maybe I'm secretly gatekeeping because people don't want the biggie chemist out there because it's already difficult enough to get their coffee. Guess we'll see. But that's the end of this tier list. And I wanted to thank everybody that made it all the way to the end, that has supported the channel. And once we do get to that 4,000 subscriber milestone, we will be doing an Asian coffee roaster tier list as well. So if you're not already subscribed, then subscribe for that reason as well. If you guys are enjoying the content, give this video a like. And again, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been part 2 of our European coffee roaster tier list. Thank you for watching.